everybody. Welcome to the June SILA Foundation webinar. I'm the Education Trustee, Cindy Davidson, and today we're delighted to be sharing updates on remote licensing exams from the three major testing services. Almost exactly 1 year ago today, the SILA Education and Training Subgroup invited representatives from PearsonVUE, Prometric, and PSI to share what were then brand new protocols for remote testing for the state insurance license exams. At that time, there were 9 states that had basically just implemented remote testing. And here we are a year later with all but 14 jurisdictions now up and running with remote exams, and so much more data and experience with this new business model. So today we'll be hearing from Brad Erickson from Prometric, Joel Norris with PearsonVUE, and Alon Schwartz of PSI with an update on states that have already adopted or are in the process of implementing remote testing. Excuse me, and they'll be bringing the advice to those of us involved in the producer licensing process. We have an hour, and although you're all on mute, sorry about that, we will take questions through the Q&A, and I'll keep an eye on those as they come in. Please let us know if you're having technical problems, and we'll try to help you out. Before we get going, I'd like to give a big shout out to our sponsor, Applicant Insight, No More Forms, providers of agent onboarding, auto appointments, and background checks. SILA Foundation relies on sponsorships to make programs like this available, so a virtual round of applause to Applicant Insight, No More Forms. We're so grateful for your support today. And now I'll turn the program over to our first presenter, Brad Erickson.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brad Erickson. I've probably met most of you. I'm with Prometric. And when we kind of, put this together, we wanted to sort of talk about our learnings. But just a short, intro if you don't know. Prometric is a technology led global leader in assessments, and we were one of the first to actually go live with remote proctoring in this space, and it's something that we're quite proud of. Last year, just to kind of as a juxtaposition, and actually just a couple of notes in here. We've actually onboarded 11 programs with ProProctor. We're currently live with 10 with Massachusetts, part of the 10 starting within the next 10 days with remote proctoring. And what we talked about, or what I emphasized last year when we spoke, was that there were sort of 3 things that we learned as we were going live and where we had challenges. And that was a shift in responsibility from the provider of testing, Prometric in this case, but I believe it's pertinent to all of us. Their responsibility shifted over to either the employer or the candidate. And by that I mean that Prometric would have actually provided the equipment, the connectivity, and the physical testing environment. And those were all responsibilities with remote proctoring that shifted over to the individual who was taking the test, whether at home or in an office space. And we had lots of challenges and things like that, as we sort of kicked off. And I think all of us, last year sort of talked about, last year a lot of us actually talked about the fact that we all have downloads, we have system compatibility checks, et cetera. But I don't think any of us, will say that it worked 100% of the time. In particular, if I, say, or Prometric indicates that this type of system or application doesn't work, it didn't stop people from coming in and trying it and then wondering why it didn't work. So I think for the most part, a lot of that has been sort of sorted out and figured out, especially with the major players, whether it be carriers or education providers, have been able to provide good guidance, to the students, to the test takers through training in terms of their expectation. But I think what we've now done as we've moved past that is there's a concept of level setting that's kind of new. And by level setting, I mean it's what are the expectations in the marketplace for what remote proctoring is and isn't, and how it is different from computer-based testing. And I think initially, as we entered into it, it's very similar. I think all 3 of the vendors have slightly different setups. It's very similar in terms of what the candidate's experience is going to be, except it's virtual and not that. But as we've learned things, as people have asked questions, one of the things that we've had to spend a lot of time is focusing on process changes. And with process changes, what we're talking about is, the rules of engagement as people are checking in, as people are leaving, are leaving the space, et cetera. And so we've worked through that. And I want to say that I think, again, with major players and people who have a lot of velocity of candidates flowing through the space, that has worked. But where I think that I'm learning more and more, where the challenges become, kind of is the awareness of remote proctoring, just even as a resource, when you kind of get into what I will just sort of refer to as like, tertiary or secondary kind of sources of education or training, more of the very localized providers. So I think we've got it, covered, pretty much at the higher levels. But I think that there's still some work to be done just to make sure that the entire industry knows that it's out there. And I think that where we're having, some of the challenges or the opportunities to kind of spend a little bit more time on the phone with the secondary and the tertiary market would have been very similar to what we'd have done with, let's say, primary, national, or regional education providers. So that's really been what we've been focused on the last, couple of months, is just sort of level setting and making sure that everybody understands that it's out there, that it's a tool that's available, or that it's coming. Process changes as we talk to the regulators, just to make sure that, after 10, 15, or 20 years of computer-based testing, there are some subtle differences as it relates to remote proctoring. And then just the last one, and probably the most important one, is just creating an awareness at all levels of sort of the vertical within the states, and the employers or the education providers, about what it takes to get this done. So it's a lot of what took place last year is taking place today, and that's really been where our focus has been the last little bit of time. In terms of just some of the high level numbers, it varies by state. We definitely are seeing upwards of 40 or 45% utilization in some states. A lot of the ideas behind remote proctoring, as we were sort of sharing it with the industry even before COVID, was it was something that would create greater availability and accessibility for constituents across the entire geography of a state, especially in lesser urban areas. But surprisingly, we're seeing the greater pickup taking place in the large urban areas where there's strong broadband, there's offices and things like that. So some challenges, and then what we're looking at going forward to sort of improve it is, can you change the device and be a bit more flexible on the device that you use to take the exams? So that's kind of where our focus has changed from last year to this year. Joel, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Brad. Hi, everybody. Joel Norris from PearsonVUE. Very happy to be invited back to another one of these panel presentations. We appreciate SILA giving us the opportunity to present on this topic, and what a year it's been. I think Cindy was commenting on when we did this last, and it was roughly about a year from now. And if you were to ask anybody, not just on this panel presentation, but probably attending this meeting, how much sleep they were getting at that point in time, it probably was not much. The industry was definitely changing in ways none of us anticipated in response to COVID, and much of the data and the subtopics associated with the data that we're presenting today will certainly underscore that. One of the things we presented on the last time that we had an opportunity to meet was, where does online proctoring fit within sort of the spectrum of possible testing options, traditional testing options, pre-COVID. And we, both with our clients as well as in industry meetings like this, tend to talk about this in terms of a spectrum of control versus access, where on the far left end of the spectrum, in terms of brick and mortar testing, we have Pearson Professional Centers. These are locations that are owned and operated by PearsonVUE. And because of that direct control that we have with those locations, everything literally inside of that test center, all of the hardware, all of the software, the actual furniture in the room, we basically dictate what that is and where it's going to go. And we have some clients that actually dictate for us how much of that furniture and how much of the hardware, software bandwidth that we have to provide in order to facilitate some very high stakes exams, some of them with very detailed electronic assets, basically need to operate. PPTC Selects are sort of a subset of Pearson Professional Centers. Again, a lot of direct management over those. And then right in the middle of this are third-party sites. So these are essentially agreements that we have with various locations around the country that have the physical facilities to administer an examination, even if they're not Pearson owned and operated, but they need to subscribe to the same security protocols and procedural protocols that our PPCs do. And then when you get over at the right-hand end of the spectrum, we have online proctored testing. We are administering the examination, but we're administering the exam outside of a physical environment that we directly control, either with our own staff, like on the far left-hand end of the spectrum, or through a third-party partnership that we have in the middle. And then on the far right, we have unproctored deliveries, which are primarily for practice tests, self-assessments, things like that. So there's an array of different methods by which we can deliver exams with online proctored testing, in our view, fitting on that far right-hand end of the spectrum. Each of them has a place. In terms of what actually occurs during the OnVUE experience, when we last met, there were a lot of questions about what are the services that we provide, how do they work, what will the candidate experience look like, what are the things that we should know about what that testing process is going to look like, soup to nuts, from registration to the end of the exam. This presentation will not focus on that, but there are a couple of things I want to highlight because I'll actually loop back to this on my last slide. So first thing, and unless I'm misspeaking, Brad, and if I am, you can come in and correct me, but one of the things that we try to do in advance of when a candidate is actually testing is try to make sure that the candidates are actually capable of taking their exams. So after you register for an OnVUE exam, you're provided with instructions to go out, download the software, and this is important, test it in the environment which you're actually going to be taking the examination. Once you've done that, and once you've successfully determined that you're able to take the exam in that environment, there are a number of different steps that we'll walk you through at what is really the pinch point in the funnel to get people to take an online test. So between registration and administration, the most challenging part of the process for us as a business, and probably the biggest lesson learned and are still learning from, is how are you able to validate an individual candidate's identity and actually get them into the testing experience as soon as possible. And there are a variety of things that we have tweaked and modified over the course of the last year to try to streamline that process as best we can, ranging from taking a picture of yourself on your phone as well as your ID and having it ready, having matching technology be used in order to determine whether or not the person who's actually on screen matches that ID, and if it doesn't, have a greeter basically intercept that process and ask the candidate for additional information to get them into the examination. In terms of who we've launched as far as our insurance states, here's a brief list, which I'll use as sort of a jumping off point for the next couple of slides, in which we'll share some data. We have 14 states that are currently on OnVUE today. We have 4 more that are prepping for OnVUE in the near future, and we have a few more that are in the process of preparing for OnVUE, which, if not listed here, are simply not on the list simply because they're a little bit further down the road for this year for various reasons, whether it's contractual or timing or procedural, whatever it might be. One point that I'll raise here with regard to the adoption of various states with respect to OnVUE, as I go into my next slide, is that all of us, with regard to the services that we're providing with respect to online proctored testing, experienced a pretty radical shift in terms of the amount of exam capacity that we were able to push through our test centers come March of 2020, which is represented here on this slide. So what you're seeing here is basically an indication of how many exams we were delivering each month. So top row, about 24,000 exams delivered in the month of January, 26 in February. Usually in March, this starts to spike, and we're in the 30,000 range, and it was cut in half. And obviously, it was cut in half due to COVID. And it was significantly cut in the month of April. Some of you on this phone call may have been present for the NIC Summit Impact of COVID-19 session that was on Tuesday of this week. Superintendent Beth Dwyer, who was co-chairing that session, collected some statistics from all 3 of the vendors. And I apologize for this not being on the slide, but this is dramatic. Overall, based on her tally of all of the examinations that were being delivered, there were 48,000 exams delivered in the month of January. If you compare that to the month of March, there were only 28,000, and there were only 4,000 overall in the month of April. So what you're seeing here is a list of our numbers specifically. We were only at 861. And then you can see where we were basically climbing out of that as a company. We were trying to do everything we possibly could to add additional test sites, find anyone with capacity in order to seat examinees for tests, and basically book seats, even in locations, especially in certain states where we had some additional third-party sites that we usually typically wouldn't enlist for this type of testing, but it was all hands on deck. So there was a multi-layered effort that consisted of us tapping into a broader third-party test center network in states that allowed us to do so. And then you can see in July, we have our first adoption of online testing, which then ramped up throughout the course of the year. One other important point I'll make about this slide is that this is representative of all of our accounts. So this is not strictly test numbers for the states that have adopted OnVUE exams. This is across the entire portfolio. So by May of 21, we have 14 states that have adopted OnVUE. Out of all of the states, the 20 some odd states that we're delivering insurance exams for, we can say as of end of May that 13% of all exams were delivered on OnVUE, and you can see those numbers ramping up. And we fully expect that there's going to be another spike in those numbers when states such as Texas and Illinois shift over to OnVUE too. So an overall adoption rate of 20% across the entire client portfolio is certainly within our sights right now. A couple of notes about pass points. We thought that it might be interesting to share some data regarding pass-fail statistics compared between test center administrations and OnVUE administrations. Apologies if this slide is somewhat confusing, but for a whole host of reasons that I'll only partially go into, it's a little bit challenging to do pass rate comparisons between states for a wide variety of reasons. The cut scores for exams between states can be very different. One state may have a 75% cut score, another one may have 70. Prerequisite licensing requirements may be different from one state to another, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things we have definitely wanted to look at is there a significant difference in the pass rates between which exam modality you're going to be using, whether it's an online proctored test or whether it's a test center test. And there are a number of reasons we want to see this data. Chief most among them is there a difference in the overall performance of one versus another, which would seem to indicate potentially that there's advantage, although we would take exception to that notion, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, or, and this is our chief most fear when we were pushing these exams out the door, and it's still something we want to keep an eye on, by virtue of delivering online proctored exams in a physical environment that we do not manage, essentially relinquishing control of the physical environment which the candidate is testing, are we putting content out there into the field that may be compromised, and if circulated in a way that we're not aware of, at least not immediately, is that potentially causing a spike in pass rates for an online proctored test versus a test center exam? So reassuringly, what we're seeing, at least so far, is the general difference between an online proctored test and what we're seeing as far as test center pass rates is relatively modest, and that's a good thing. You see some outliers here in the data, and I should point out that the state names are intentionally left blank for all the reasons that I was describing before. We want to be careful about drawing undue comparisons between states. But looking at these as a group, just to assess what kind of variation we're seeing between pass rates by exam line, by different state, so far these numbers are looking pretty good. We are looking for outliers, so when we're pushing, double-digit differences, whether an online test is faring, 10% plus better or possibly not as good as a test center exam, that may be telling us something about the administration of that particular test. It may be telling us something about the content of the test. But these are numbers that we're tracking, and in an effort for both the individual clients in our portfolio as well as for meetings like this for the industry overall, just to kind of take a test of where we stand with regard to the reliability of the exam administration models. One other point about this list too is that we purposely left off the repeat test takers from this list. When we add repeat test takers into the list, the comparisons aren't quite as clean. And we'll talk a little bit more about repeat test takers in terms of lessons learned here when I get to the final slide too. What have we learned about online proctored testing in terms of advantages? There are some objectively obvious advantages to online testing in terms of the candidate experience, candidate access, and then also solving a very big problem, which was limited access into brick and mortar testing over the course of the past year. One of them is that when given the opportunity to take an exam or register for exam on a single registration system, you're essentially giving candidates more choice. And by giving them more choice, you're essentially giving them more options to test, possibly sooner and more than likely sooner, especially during COVID, than they would if they would just have the opportunity to test at a brick and mortar test site. I sort of conflated 1 and 2 here together in terms of flexible testing locations. Locations may be represented here in air quotes, since online proctored testing is essentially a very large virtual test center for all intents and purposes. You have the ability to test 24/7. There are typically seats, virtual seats, available for testing more frequently and more readily than there would be at an actual test center. And that gives candidates the ability to schedule exams outside of normal business hours, point number 3. So these are advantages that we're hearing very positive feedback from the field for regarding both the candidate experience as well as the licensing experience. And then finally, with regard to the last 2 here, in terms of benefits that we've been receiving positive feedback on, the check-in process, which I had mentioned before, is something that we're attempting to streamline because, again, this is the choke point. We do have to verify everybody's ID and also make sure that they're able to actually access the test before they can take it. If there is a point in time in which a candidate runs into a problem with regard to administration of an online test, it's here. So a great deal of our time and effort as a company has been spent with fiscal investment too, going into improving this process from a technical standpoint as well as an operational standpoint. And then real-time electronic ID verification, same thing. We're making investments in trying to make that process easier too. So the faster that we can verify someone's identification and make sure that it matches who is actually taking the test, the faster we can seat them for the exam. Final slide here, other considerations and things for the industry in general to consider, as well as our clients, regulators to consider as we dive into the future of online proctored testing. One is that we would encourage people not to overinterpret it, differences in pass rates. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it's a little bit seductive to assume that a higher pass rate for an online proctored test implies that there's something about the online proctored test experience. You're at home, you're relaxed, you're going to be more capable of passing the test. But the test method itself, it's what's increasing the pass rate. That's not necessarily the case. There could be a wide variety of reasons why there may be a change in the pass rate up or down, depending on the test method. And overall, at least for the moment, we're not seeing necessarily statistically significant numbers that would indicate that your ability or propensity to pass the exam is going to be greater using one method versus another. Second point here is that access can still be an issue. So just by virtue of the fact that we're offering online proctored testing does not necessarily mean that the people that we would believe and hope would be most advantaged by this are necessarily being advantaged by it. So in states that have a very big geographic area where you would assume that online proctored testing is essentially going to fulfill a need for people who no longer would have to drive 50, 75 miles to get to a test center, it all depends on your internet access. The vast majority of the issues that we encounter and log with regard to what causes someone to fail to successfully complete a test have to do with internet connectivity. There are 2 things happening simultaneously during the administration of an exam. One of them is that you are being monitored on video and audio throughout the course of the exam. So you're essentially streaming just like you would during the course of a Zoom meeting or in a meeting like this, your physical presence being monitored through that streaming service to a proctor in real time. So already you're chewing into the bandwidth that's available to you as a candidate just through the monitoring activity alone. And then the exam itself is, through the software that's being used to administer it, is also essentially an encrypted streaming process that in real time is monitoring all of your activity during the course of the test. So if you have limited bandwidth, you're pushing the envelope with regard to doing both of these things at the same time. So better bandwidth means a better experience, and a better experience possibly means that you have a better opportunity to take the exam. So everything that we're trying to do as a business in terms of promoting efficiency is trying to come up with the most reliable method by which we can basically host those two services at the same time. I mentioned this before, and I hate to harp on it again, but knock on wood, we haven't seen egregious candidate behavior yet, at least within the insurance environment, but we have seen it with respect to possible cheating incidents. The operational procedures that we can undertake and enforce inside of a test center cannot be easily or readily enforced when you're basically monitoring a candidate from home, potentially from 1,000 miles away or further. That said, number 4, security is an ongoing concern. While the numbers that we're seeing, at least in terms of pass rates and the initial data that we've collected over the past several months, are promising in terms of maintaining the reliability of the exam experience and therefore the security of the exam content, the possibility always exists, and perhaps even more so than now, and we've seen plenty of news stories out there regarding incidents of hacking on a scale that we just simply have not ever seen. Hacking is a potential issue. Lower fidelity attempts at trying to crib exam content or mark down exam content, basically do something with respect to monitoring the examination from a location off camera. These are all ongoing concerns that anyone who signs up to administer an online proctored test should be concerned with. And we tried to take active measures to basically outline for our clients what those concerns are so that they can make a qualified decision with regard to what the pros and cons are of adopting this test modality. And then last but not least, state and vendor contract requirements are going to continue to change on many different levels. During the course of the last year, we've actually changed one of the back-end services, and it was a fairly significant change. And if any vendor is changing from, say, a hosting service, and I'll pick an example, if you're switching from AWS to Azure, for instance, you're going to have to update all of your compliance requirements, and you're going to have contract updates as a result. If you have state IT staff that are intimately involved in your contracting process, you've just entered into a slightly different realm of requirements gathering and credentialing that you need to validate in order to make sure that both the brick and mortar testing requirements that we as a test vendor have already passed muster on are equally applied, and in some cases even extended to online proctored testing requirements. So we're sort of entering into new territory here with regard to the technologies that are supporting this testing service, and then the due diligence that our clients and us as a vendor need to be mindful of as we enter into it. I think I will wrap up there and pass it over to you, Alon.
All right. Thanks, Joel. All right. Hi, everyone. Good to see you virtually, or good for you to see me. Thanks for including me. So just along the lines, we've heard a lot of terms today: remote proctoring, online proctoring, and then the other term is what we call multimodal test delivery, which, when you hear that, is a test delivery mode for programs where the candidates get the option to either continue taking the exams at a test center or giving them the online proctoring option. So for all of our, and I'll get to the next slide to show where we've done that for our insurance clients, all of our licensure clients that we've converted to remote proctoring, the test centers are still an option. So test centers are not going away. It's just now we're adding another mode of exam delivery, which is online proctoring. In terms of where we've done that today for our insurance programs, we started off with Washington. Washington was our first one back in October 2019, well before COVID, obviously. And if you look at here, the next one coming in the next couple of weeks will be Arkansas. So pretty much all of our insurance programs, except for one, have now converted to this multimodal delivery option. Now, in terms of adoption rates, this is something that we're looking at closely for many reasons. Joel touched upon the test center capacity, and obviously COVID had a huge impact on all of our test centers and capacity. And thank goodness it seems like the world's sort of coming back to where it was, but it's still something that's out there. So it's something that we're looking at, not only for capacity planning, but we also want to see if candidates are actually utilizing the remote proctor option. And so some of the stats that I pulled from our insurance clients, amongst all the clients that have currently gone to all of our insurance clients that have gone to this multimodal delivery, the average is 51% adoption rate. So more than half of the overall insurance candidates are choosing remote proctor, which is phenomenal. And again, I think it's a testament to a couple of things. I think there's still a little bit of fear on some people of going to a test center. Again, hopefully that's gonna decrease over time. But I also just think that it's a testament to show that remote proctoring is working, both from candidates. It's easy to use. The process works. The technology is there. So we're really happy to see that. Typically, when we launch a program to this dual modality, the first month is relatively low. It takes a little bit of time for the word to get out, for candidates to get comfortable with it. Typically, also candidates will have already scheduled before we open that up. But we typically see after a first month quite a big jump to the next month, about 15 to 20% increase in adoption rate between month 1 and month 2. Another interesting stat is any of our programs that we've migrated that have had the remote proctor for over 3 months, they all have an adoption rate of 35% or higher, which is, again, phenomenal to see that the candidates are choosing that option. And then a really interesting stat, I mentioned that we launched Washington Insurance well before COVID. They were actually the first state regulatory program to adopt remote proctoring. When we started with them in October of 2019, they were at 14%. Obviously, during COVID, when a lot of our test centers were closed, they were one of the few programs in the country, because they had the option that just resumed, continued testing normally. The adoption rates in those months were in the high 80s, low 90s. But even today, when test centers are back up and running in the state, it still has a high adoption rate of about 66%. So again, it's just a testament to show that, even though the options to go back to the test centers are there, candidates are still choosing to take the exam remotely. Just a couple more stats. We've talked again about remote proctoring, and we did this last year where it was still it was definitely new. But this is, and I think Joel and Brad would agree, like, this remote proctoring is not just a Band-Aid for COVID. It is definitely a modality that's here to stay. And candidates, even though, again, they have that option to go back to the test center, are going to continue to take remote proctoring. I think if we do this webinar a year from now, I think between all three of us, I would assume that all of those adoption rates for candidates taken remotely will be that much higher. So it's definitely something that, we all moved really quickly during COVID because there's a huge need, but now it's something that is just everyone wants and is much more accepted. The next thing I want to talk about is just some of the things that we've learned and have seen and have evolved since we've really launched remote proctoring on a mass scale. Obviously we want to ensure a positive testing experience. Joel and Brad touched about kind of the system requirements. Obviously, when you're dealing with remote proctoring, you're now dealing with a candidate's home environment as opposed to our environment at the test center, which we fully control. So that, we want to ensure that the candidates all know what those system requirements are for their computers. We have a link on our website that shows it, and it's in all of the candidate information bulletin. The next one that I've highlighted is something that we really are promoting everywhere we can, is what we call a system compatibility check. So besides knowing what your system needs, we have a way for you to check that your system actually is compatible with what we need. So that is something that is in all our confirmation emails, in all of our collateral, in all of the candidate handbooks, and any sort of FAQs that we have posted. And we ask candidates, candidates can do this well before they take their test. So it's something that we really encourage all candidates to do, so that when they come and take their exam, they're comfortable knowing that their system is compatible. We often see candidates who show up and then do it and then realize something's not right. So this is something that we really, really are stressing everywhere we can for people to do that. And again, they can do that even before scheduling an exam. They can just check to make sure that their computer does meet it. Joel did touch about it, but the fact that, remote proctoring candidates literally can take the test 24/7. So, I know for the test centers, obviously we all have finite number of hours, but this one really you have 24/7 availability. There is tech support for remote proctoring. We do that via phone and chat. Some of the other things we recommend, you can do your exam on Wi-Fi, but obviously Wi-Fi, I've been working from home for over a year now, and every now and then, although today I'm in the office, if you can see behind me, every now and then, the Wi-Fi goes out. So if you have a place where you can do a wired internet connection, it's probably just a bit more stable. Some of the other things we recommend is obviously we want a quiet environment. You can't be in a room with other people. As part of the check during check-in is we ensure that you're in a room by yourself. We ask you to remove prohibited items. So, while you do, and Brad touched upon it and Joel as well, while you do kind of a room scan, we're looking to see what's on your desk and what's in the room. So we're obviously going to have you remove anything. And we prefer that candidates check in 15 minutes prior. That way they can go through the check-in process, ensure their system is compatible, and then begin their exam. Both Brad and Joel touched on, obviously security when we're delivering a high stakes exam like these insurance exams is of the utmost importance. The number one question I get from any of our clients or anyone really when talking about remote proctoring is it as secure? There's no way it can be as secure as a test center. And the answer is it is. There is security. Obviously for us, it's the most important thing. It's just done differently, right? Obviously there's not a proctor in the room. There's not a proctor sort of walking around the testing room, but there is a proctor watching you. And the other thing is we do have technology in place as well. So just some of the things that you have to consider when moving to a remote proctored program, things like breaks. At a test center, candidates, if it's in a building, they'll walk out, go to the restroom, come back. At home, do we allow the candidate to go and use the restroom because then they're going to another room in the house? So, taking, scratch paper, things like that. So there's obviously nuances that are going to be different from taking an exam at a test center. But again, those things we work with all of our clients on to see how they want their program run. But again, focusing on the fact that security is of the utmost importance. And along those lines, again, I have a slide, it's a little bit similar to Joel's in talking about pass rates. I think what this slide is showing, and obviously there's a lot of data and graph here, but what this slide really is showing is that the pass rates for test centers and remote proctored are relatively similar. It would be, and Joel mentioned it as well. It would be a big, if there was a huge discrepancy, then obviously you could say that one modality is not the same as the other, but the percentage pass rates are so similar that I think it's a testament to show that whether you're taking it at a test center or remotely, security is there, and it really ends up being sort of the same. While it's not the same experience for the test taker, but the data shows that the results end up being the same regardless of the modality that they're taking. And with that, I will hand it back off, I guess, to Cindy.
Yeah, and I'm surprised. We're usually such a chatty group, SILA. I'm surprised we haven't been flooded with questions, but I know that it's been super interesting. I was on a different call this morning, and a regulator was marveling at the fact that a candidate can now apply, take their pre-licensing education, and take their license exam pretty much from their kitchen. And that's like something that would be unimaginable even like 5 or 10 years ago. So I just can't believe, I think we're all kind of blown away about how fast this all changed. I do have a request for the testing services. I know that you guys are dealing with your clients and there's contractual issues, but I think the SILA community would really appreciate any early heads up that y'all can give us for new states coming online, right? So I know that we think that there's 7 or 8 states that are going to move to remote testing, and we do hear about it on the SILA updates, but sometimes, it's already happened. So anything that you guys can do to get the word out to the SILA community, even if it's a week or 2 in advance. I do see one question came in. Where can we find a live list of which states offer remote proctoring? I don't know, guys. Do you have that on your website? Or do you have to look state by state?
This is Len. I'll answer that. For us, I don't think we do, but that's something that I can easily prepare, and Cindy, I can maybe send it to you, and then if you want to share that with the group.
Sure.
I think probably all 3 of us could probably, Joel and Brad, I'll let you go talk, but we can send them all to you. And
we've been keeping track of it, but I don't know that I feel 100% confident that we have it all right. So if you guys want to send the list of which of your clients are utilizing remote proctoring, we'll pull it together, and I'll have, it looks like NNPR has a list. So it exists.
I was about to say, I
exists.
think they have posted one online. I was trying to find the link, but it's not at my fingertips. But I believe that is the most current aggregate list of all the vendors who have pushed them online. Yeah.
So we have, a lot of people are asking for that. Observation that in rural state like Wyoming, remote proctoring is being adopted with enthusiasm. So we're glad to hear about that. I think we could pull the slides together, Mary Ellen. We're being asked for a download of the slides. I think that would be totally appropriate. And we'll be able to send those out. And Alone, you touched on it. I was hoping for some advice. We do give advice to our own customers at ExamFX. We will say, if you're going to do remote proctoring, make sure you read all the instructions, make sure you do the system check. And I think you ran through a lot of that. Is there anything else you would give as advice to people who are considering sitting for the remote exam?
I'll go real quick. So I think 2 things. The system compatibility check is really a big thing for us. I think we notice when candidates have issues, and I think it's now part of the tech support, sort of what the first thing is, did you run through it? And so in the beginning, it was a lot of it didn't until they came to it. So that one really is a big thing for us. And then the other thing, and I think Joel, you might have touched on this, is as great as this is, and we all think that this is great, and really this is the future. Like, this is not for all 100% of candidates, right? There's going to be those candidates that this, depending on where they live or the internet or whatever it may be, or their computer, that is not for them. So, it's one of those where we do talk to candidates when we're talking to tech support. We have candidates who come back multiple times, and eventually we have to, we tell them, look, you probably should go to a test center. I think candidates, I think appreciate that and understand that, but it is something that right now I would say there's a subset of candidates that probably should continue to go to test centers depending on their environment.
I'll add one more really quick comment to that. We try our best with the education providers as well as with the producers that we're in semi-routine contact with to provide answers to questions concerning how we set up the exam software and how we support it. The tech support that we offer is typically offered by the individual greeter that is trying to assist the candidate through their initial launch if they're having trouble, and occasionally by the proctor if something was to fail during the exam. So it's very one-on-one in that respect with regard to the individual candidate. We have had requests from some producers who, for instance, are trying to set up new licensees and are actually giving them laptops to provide sort of bulk tech support in an effort to hook up potential licensees with an OnVUE exam. That's more challenging for us. So when we start getting into issues where you essentially have kind of a lockdown laptop that's being used for business purposes, and you may have particular firewall concerns or their admin right restrictions that are in place based on how you hand those laptops before you hand those laptops off to your potential licensees. that gets sticky for us. So if there's anybody on this line that we unfortunately have had to tell over the last couple of months that that's a little bit more problematic from a customer support standpoint, there are reasons for that. We actually get a lot of those kinds of requests from other clients within the broader Pearson portfolio, like IT and so on. And it would be virtually impossible to try to meet all of those needs on a daily or weekly basis. And B, we also find it problematic to give you IT advice with regard to your network or your setup for individual devices, because for obvious reasons, we just don't want to assume that liability. So unfortunately, that's kind of where the water meets the shore. We would much rather prefer and encourage individual candidates to be taking the test on their own personal device in an environment, whether it's an office or a home that they're familiar with and that they know has reliable internet access.
Awesome. Brad, was there anything you wanted to add on advice?
No, I think that kind of pretty much covers it. No,
Okay, cool.
I think it's pretty similar across all three of us.
So we always get people who've kind of let it go to the last second, and then they're like, I need to move my date and my appointment. And there really is like a 2-day, you can't just cancel your exam and reschedule it. So that's something that we definitely have run up against is, letting people know if you need to reschedule, you need to know that ahead of time. You can't just do it the same day. So we have a lot of nominations for states that people would like to see go to remote testing. That was interesting. And then there is a question about, what about the states where there's remote testing still not an option? Are you making an effort to increase appointment availability in those states for like the test centers?
I can start there. I'll start with this one, and then I think the others can add in. I think organizationally, you're looking at capacity, on an ongoing basis, and you're making decisions when to open up and where. Periodically, demand will outstrip capacity, and you make necessary adjustments by extending hours or days. So, I would just, say to folks, if there's a particular market, where this becomes an issue that they haven't seen it being redressed at the moment, just to raise it to the appropriate staff at the appropriate vendor and ask them for some assistance.
Yeah, right. Well said, Brad. Agreed.
Okay, agreement. We're in violent agreement. I'd love that. So I think, Joel, you said that you haven't really been running up against too much in the way of dishonesty or bad behavior. I don't know about anyone else, but I think the pandemic turned everyone into like cheating engines. It's just ridiculous the way people are trying to skip through and do things faster than they should. I guess, are there any funny anecdotes or anything that y'all want to share? I know that the proctor has the ability to end an exam if they feel something is going on that shouldn't be going on, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's, again, back to the whole security concept. And, I'd like to, I say this always, like, unfortunately, but fortunately, we catch cheaters, right? I wish there weren't, but there are, and we do. And some industries, there are more than others. But I think it's similar in the sense of we are proctoring. There are violations that we're looking for, and so if we catch a cheater, in that sense, we end the exam similar to what we would do at a test center. And then again, the process then becomes similar as we then communicate to our client with what happened. There is a video recording of the entire session, so similar to our test centers where you give them a package of here's what a report as well as video. There is video as well. So once, again, unfortunately, when we catch those cheaters, what we're able to provide to our clients is quite a similar package to what they're getting from the test centers.
Yeah,
Excellent.
Agreed. It's interesting. I think we've been seeing more poor behavior at the test center over the course of the past year and a half than we've seen previously, I would say, at least in the prior 5. And while that isn't necessarily being reflected downstream, in some cases, at least within the insurance market, we have heard stories about people who will flout just basic decency protocol for other types of exams or different exam programs that Pearson administers, where it seems pretty obvious that you should be wearing a shirt while you're having an online proctored test, but there are a surprising number of people who don't think that that's cause for concern. So there have been cases where people have been belligerent. There have been cases, not necessarily again with regard to insurance exams, but with respect to the process. We've had a couple of cases where people have just tried to punk the process and haven't really had an interest in taking the examination, and basically just exhibited poor behavior with the proctor. As soon as the test was being administered, in those cases, the exams would need to be canceled. So it's been an interesting experience to see sort of the difference between intentionally bad behavior, whether it's possible cheating behavior or failure to comply with instructions. For instance, if you are told after you leave the camera view that you need to come back to the camera view because the proctor does not know what you're doing and you don't come back, you're going to get bounced out of the exam and you're going to have a case written up for that particular exam experience. There are individuals who either don't understand that or don't respect that, and as a result, they will have a case written up about their experience. So those rules and guidelines are made pretty clear, or at least as clear as we think they can be at this point, but there's always room to tweak and modify and try to prepare the candidates with regard to what this experience entails, because essentially they're managing their own test center when they sit for the exam. So professional behavior and behavior that does not hint at some kind of impropriety is pretty paramount if you want to get through the exam experience and make sure you get your test results back in a timely manner.
Well said. Awesome. So I think there's one more question, and that is the rescheduling window 2 days for every testing service? I think it is.
Could you repeat the question? I missed the middle
part.
So
if you need to reschedule your exam, is it a 2-day? Does it have to be 2 days in advance?
Oh, okay. For us, it depends on the exam program. We have some exam programs that would permit you to reschedule within 24 hours. Some of them have a longer window by design, which would even be true with regard to test center testing. But generally speaking, the likelihood, if the business rules for a particular client would permit you to reschedule with no buffer period between exam attempts, it is possible for at least some programs that you'd be able to reschedule within 24 hours.
Yeah. I'd echo that. I think most of our programs are 2 days, and then there's others that it just varies depending on the program.
Same for Prometric.
So the best advice is to go look up what the state rule says.
Exactly.
Yeah, go from there. And then Donna has another cheating question. So Donna's very interested in the whole cheating experience, and who isn't, right? So what are the repercussions? So say somebody gets an exam ended, and there is a case report, or however y'all handle it. Are they prevented from retesting? Like, how's that handled?
So this is Brad. Having gone through that experience a couple of times, each regulatory body, takes it, slightly differently. Some regulatory bodies believe that the candidate experience at the test center is not on their watch necessarily, and that it's up to us. But they will, if there is a police report, have an administrative hearing. And just to make sure before they get a license. And there are other states that are very active. Involved in and will help make decisions in terms of what happens to the candidate based on the behavior, even if it takes place at our test center. So it kind of varies, state by state in terms of how they want to kind of manage that activity.
That makes sense. All right, perfect. Well, guys, I think we've reached the end of our time together, but this has been incredible. As usual, thanks to the testing services. You guys are always so wonderful about supporting SILA and SILA Foundation and being willing to share your expertise and time. So thanks to Brad and Joel and Alone for spending time with us today on this still evolving subject. We're so much further than we were a year ago, and it's really great to see how the technology has caught up to the needs of a distributed and remote workforce. This webinar has been recorded, and it will be posted via a link to the SILA Foundation website. You can share it with members of your team who might have missed it. All of you will be receiving a post-webinar survey, so be sure to fill that out and provide candid feedback that will help us improve going forward. Thanks again to Applicant Insight No More Forms for their generous sponsorship of this webinar. SILA Foundation provides these free of charge as part of our mission and outreach. If you learned something of value today, please consider a personal or corporate donation to the foundation. We rely on donations and sponsorships to keep programs like this going. So if your company might be interested in sponsoring a future webinar, let me or Mary Ellen know. And speaking of future webinars, I'm going to do a little commercial. We have a bonus webinar this month, next week, June 23rd. The Senior Executive of the National Flood Insurance Program will provide an overview of FEMA's new pricing methodology. It's called Risk Rating 2.0. This program leverages best practices and technology to formulate flood rates that are actuarially sound, equitable, easier to understand, and which better reflect a property's real flood risk. The goal is to fix long-standing inequities in flood insurance pricing and to be better equipped for the reality of frequent flooding caused by climate change. So some people's premiums are going to go significantly up and some are going to be significantly down, and I think everyone will be interested in learning about that. Important, this webinar next week won't be recorded thanks to FEMA rules, so be sure you register and attend live. You won't get a chance to watch it afterwards. The official invite with registration details will be released this week. Thanks so much for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.